All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Before I get into my spiel, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Saddam, the Associate Vice Provost for Innovation and New Ventures, for a little announcement.
All right. Very good. So I used to be, I still am a home brewer. And I used to have a homebrew club. And when you brought something, and you said, I brought something for you to share, everyone would say, tell me about this beer. All right. So I brought something for you for me to share. You're supposed to say, tell me about this beer. You should be more excited. It's beer, right? Yes. I brought something to share. Tell me about beer. Excellent. All right. So today, what we have is the relaunch of 1866, the UNH beer. It was brewed with Tuckerman Brewery. It is actually, since we're talking about IP today, it's a trademark. So 1866 is the year that we were founded. So it's also the trademark of UNH that we licensed to Tuckerman. They make the beer for us, and then the proceeds of this go to the Brewing Science Program. So it's out in the market today. This is more or less the first time it's being out for people to taste. I heard there was one wayward place where it was found, but it's reaching the market today. Where there's going to be a bunch of news stories about it in the run-up to homecoming, and the official launch of the beer is homecoming. But what I will tell you, since you're in the room, is go buy it now, because the last time we did this, the beer sold out in 3 days. So it's a small batch, it's about a 40-barrel batch. It'll be on draft in a couple of locations. They're going to be doing a fundraiser for the Brewing Science Program at the Thirsty Moose Tavern in Exeter, I think next Thursday, but I'm not sure, but we'll post it up on the website. So there's some of this out there. Get it while it's hot, because again, the last time it was 3 days and gone. So it's very exciting. And now I'm going to drink this one.
Thank you, Mark. Again, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Simon. I'm the university's Senior Licensing Manager for Engineering and the Physical Sciences. And this fall, we're offering a mini seminar called Hot Topics in IP and Technology, where we're inviting industry experts to come and talk about the latest IP topics and emerging technologies and their implications on research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank our very generous sponsors for this Wildcatalyst series. Hamilton Brooks Smith Reynolds, who's a Boston-based full-service intellectual property law firm, and Saunders and Silverstein, a law firm in Amesbury, Mass. that provides services related to trademarks, copyright, internet software, and entertainment law. Thank you, Mary Lou. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it very much. And I invite you to visit the front table to review materials from both of our sponsors. Following the presentation, we invite you to join us for a warm networking session. We have some food and beverages, including 1866. And as a reminder, if you're under 21, we do have non-alcoholic options for you. Our speakers tonight are Mary Lou Wakimura and Matt Jacobs. Mary Lou is a principal at Hamilton Brooks Smith Reynolds with years of IP law experience, with a background in applied math and computer engineering. She has particular experience in imaging, virtual currency, cloud and SaaS-based platforms, machine learning, social networks, and open source software. And Matt Jacobs is the director, legal counsel for Synopsys, which is a company that is committed to making technology smarter and more secure. Prior to Synopsys, Matt was a vice president and general counsel for Black Duck Software, whose products automate the process of securing and managing open source software. And Black Duck was acquired by Synopsys in 2017. Congrats. Both Mary Lou and Matt are alums of the University of New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce School of Law, and thank you very much, have advised UNHInnovation on numerous topics, including open source software, in the context of UNH's intellectual property. So please join me in welcoming both Mary Lou and Matt as they embark on sharing the challenges and opportunities of open source software.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Great. Thanks. We'll take turns here. So open source has many rewards, but also challenges along the way. So Matt and I would like to enlighten you both from the, I'll say, legal groundwork perspective, as well as just the hit the ground running on hands perspective. I'm a partner at an IP boutique, as the other Matt was saying. This gets tricky with the two Matts. The client base that I tend to focus on are in the computer-related and software-related innovations area. So I advise on procuring of patent rights, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets in patent portfolio management along the way with licensing issues such as OSS.
Hi everybody. Glad to be here. In addition to a graduate of the university's law school, I'm also a graduate of the undergraduate program, so I spent my time here in Durham. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I lived in a building that was on this property. I don't know, any old timers remember a really ugly green kind of apartment building? Yeah, so all right, so that's why I feel like I've kind of come home. And then I also hold a MBA from Plymouth State. So for a New Yorker, transplanted New Yorker, I feel like I've done my rounds, right? I was in private practice like Mary Lou for a while, and in that time started bumping up against open source more and more. Say this was like 2006, 2007. Finding that a lot of companies were using open source during the Great Recession as a resource, and then a lot of lawyers were saying, hold on, there's all sorts of issues, there's all sorts of problems, you should slow down. So I found myself kind of mediating discussions amongst the lawyers and the engineers at my clients' locations, and helping them sort of move past the question of do you or don't you use open source to the you are, so you should be thinking proactively about how to manage it. And that's what started bumping me up against Black Duck. Back in 2007-ish, and so yes, I had the good fortune of joining Black Duck as their only in-house lawyer, part of the company that grew from about 50 people to 450 people, and then we got acquired by a 14,000 person enterprise. So good exit, and in any event, great to be back here. We're going to divide and conquer this thing, and you'll know because Synopsys' primary color is purple. And Hamilton Brooks' primary color is red, so you know where the slides came from. So this is one I'll take. So the agenda, we're going to go over, first of all, the evolution of IP in general. You know, how does IP serve us? And then I'm going to focus that down onto a distinct piece of it, open source software. What is open source? We'll go through that. Look at the different types of open source licenses that you'll bump up against if you're in this arena, how those licenses then work with patents is Mary Lou's specialty, so she's going to handle that. A lot of lawyers get focused on the licenses themselves. Are the licenses acceptable, not acceptable? And that's a big piece of the equation, but there are other reasons why you want to be actively managing and tracking your open source reuse. So I'll hit on some of those, and then we'll hopefully have time for questions. But we're a small enough group that if there are any questions that arise as we go, don't hesitate.
Right, if it's unclear, raise your hand and we can restate it. Is this a loud enough volume? Everybody's good? Okay. So I'd be hard-pressed to say that software isn't everywhere. I think of all the different science disciplines and technology areas, most all have, through their years of evolution, converged on software. So pick a field, any field. We go from your manual type of and mechanical type of agricultural equipment all the way to computer programmed and controlled irrigation systems. Same within the field of medicine. Started off with leech therapy, and now we're all the way to digital radiology and robotic surgery. Field of transportation, very similar beginnings as far as very mechanical. Now we're into the electronic age where we have autonomous vehicles literally driven by software. And can't miss out on the electronics and communications area, going from your telegraph to telephone, television, and soon enough tell the world through the internet. So where would we be without software? It's all around us and in every different facet of technology growth. So with that demand, all of that demand for software, who's supplying? Where is the stream? Certainly in the supply stream is OSS community. That's pushing our patent portfolios, our different IP portfolios, from a traditional blend to this on the far right side, more, I'll say, fluid blend, including the OSS licensing. So you're in the traditional sense, patents are trying to cover engineering concepts, some of the innovations and contributions to the technology. Your trademarks are covering and protecting your business signature, how you attach a name, an indicator of you as the source of certain goods or services. Trade secrets are more or less a contractual, confidential arrangement that's trying to keep the value of certain data, techniques, formulas from being exposed to your competitors. So it gives you as a company a leg up in those techniques. Copyrights are protecting original authored works once in a fixed medium. So source code, your programming, does qualify as a literary work in the eyes of the copyright law. And with that, if you're using a traditional blend of licensing, that would be more or less under a controlled, I'll say structured set of steps for that type of licensing. Fast forward to today, where we're sharing open source software, which comes with it some software licensing that's not going through your traditional negotiate, rewrite a clause, counter offer the clause. It's much more random and unstructured in that sense. And so that's pushing our IP portfolios to have a different model. And we, as Matt was alluding to, it's not whether or not you're consciously choosing and saying yes or no, you just need to control it and manage it. The set of copyrights that's at play are a copyright owner has the right to control who is allowed to make a copy of the covered work, who is allowed to make a derivative off of that covered work and distribute. So that's the underlying copyright set of rights in the traditional sense. OSS is a contractual type of arrangement, a license, that is freeing up some of those controls. So it's a way of contracting away the traditional sense of copyrights. So with that groundwork, that backdrop of the, I'll say, laws at play here, what really is OSS from a practical sense, Matt?
Back to the purple. One way to start to just think about open source is to compare it and to contrast it to software you're probably familiar with, like say something you license from Microsoft. Right? So Microsoft owns the copyright in those materials. Their engineers created it, so as they're a copyright holder, so they have all the rights in that. They allow us to use their software under a license, and we've all seen variations of licenses from large commercial vendors. There might be some patents at work on some of the Microsoft stuff as well. So you think of the intellectual property regimes at work, it's copyright, it's maybe patents, but probably I think one of the greatest protections they have is trade secrets, because what they're letting you see is the version of the software that is the binary version. That is the version your computer knows how to read. It's a set of ones and zeros, and I'm sure there's some engineers in the room who could make some sense of this. I was a history major here, so I can't. If I look at a series of ones and zeros, they mean nothing to me. And so that's binary. When we talk about open source, okay, it still has a copyright holder. The copyright holder still has all the interests and protections in the original authorship, their software, but what they're allowing us to see is the underlying source code, the human readable stuff that the average software programmer can look at and say, oh, I understand how this is put together. I can improve upon this. I can learn from it. Microsoft doesn't want you to know that. They don't want you to see that, right? So that's really the biggest distinction in my eyes, that it's the availability of that human readable source code, which makes this open source. And technically, to call something open source, it does have to be under a certain type of license, and we'll look at a few flavors of open source licenses. Before I do that, just to get your head around how big the open source universe is, you're all coming in contact with open source all the time. As Mary Lou said, yes?
What does third party mean in this?
Where are you?
Let's go back one.
Means it wasn't created by the company that's using it. It is licensed in from a third party. Microsoft would be a licensed in, yeah. Good, thank you for asking that. In any event, just so we get our heads around just the size of the open source universe and how much of the stuff we're coming in contact with. As Mary Lou said, we're we're seeing almost everything move toward a software-based version. All technology is moving that way, and an ever-increasing amount of the software that you're interacting with is open source. So, not to make this a infomercial for Black Duck, but we have a team of people on site who've been at this since about 2003, constantly scouring the internet and sucking into our knowledge base all the open source they can find, along with whatever metadata they can locate, like what the project type is, what the license is, if there's any security vulnerabilities, all these things we'll talk about as we go. So right now in there is 530 billion plus lines of code. And again, just being a history major, I don't have a way of getting my head around that. So I said to one of my engineers, if you were to sit down and try to pound out 530 billion lines of code, how long would that take? And the answer was 10 plus million years. So you start to understand what we're talking about. From a lawyer's perspective, we're tracking about 2,600 different flavors of open source licenses. So these licenses all contain obligations. They all contain various and sometimes unacceptable obligations from a commercial contracting standpoint. And you're supposed to be tracking all those and abiding by them to reuse some of this all this open source. And we'll talk some more about vulnerabilities as we go. But this is an area that I think a lot of lawyers tend to overlook. We're looking at the licenses and tend to forget that software is software, and all software has possibility for security issues. And so the value of open source, it's pretty obvious. It's just a great accelerator to innovation. A fantastic example of this is think about your Android-based phones. Where were we a handful of years ago? It looked like the iPhone was going to be it. That's all you're going to have. Apple was running away with that market. And Google buys up something called Android. They tweak it, make it a really good and efficient operating system, and release it under something called the Apache license, which is a permissive license, and basically saying to the world, here are the guts of a device. You take this, you run with it. And that about amounts to 80% of the effort that goes into creating a functional phone. So now you have all these companies like the Samsungs of the world only needing to focus on those elements of their product that are competitive differentiators. They don't have to worry about reinventing the wheel, i.e. that operating system that none of us care about, right? We just want to know if the thing works. But how well does it work? Well, it should work well, but we all are really worried about is to take great photos, to do all this cool stuff. Well, that's the innovation that leveraging something like open source brings to the table, and there's plenty of examples of this. I said before that there are about 2,600 flavors of these kind of licenses. They do basically break down into two camps, if you will. The first camp I'll call permissive licenses, and the second camp I'll call copyleft licenses. So permissive licenses, and I have an example of one coming up, easy to abide by. Basically, the copyright holder is licensing their software to you under a permissive open source license that says, do with this what you want, I don't really care. And the world is moving more and more toward permissive licenses. I think collaboration is winning out over the copyleft licenses, which say, here's my stuff, use it, and I'll have some examples of this. We'll go into this in a little more detail too. Use it, but if you use it under certain circumstances, you have to make a commitment back to the open source community, and we'll go through that. And this is where the sort of rubber hits the road as far as where lawyers and others have problems around these licenses. So this is a very typical, very popular, I think the most popular permissive license. And this is almost essentially the entire license. You can see that the grant is very broad. Again, the copyright holder is granting you all these rights to do with their software, all these wonderful things. They're, of course, giving it to you for free, so they're not going to take any liability or make any kind of representations or warranties. And the only thing you, as the reuser of it, are supposed to do is give them attribution. So you put their name up in lights. If you go to in your iPhone or whatever to the legal section notices, you'll see just endless scrolls of people's names with copyright notices, and that's because there's the obligation to include that person's name so they get credit, and that's about it for those. Yeah. The other side of the equation, so permissive on one side, all the other side of the restrictive. The restrictive, the granddaddy of the restrictive licenses, the one that everyone in this field runs into right away, and that's where I first stumbled upon this, is in dealing with a license called the general public license. I see some people nodding heads. Well, you've read it.
Some of it.
What's your opinion?
It's harsh.
It's harsh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were nodding your head too.
Yeah, I think I agree with what it does, and I think it's fantastic, and I think it leverages companies not to, like, if you want to work out a multi-licensing agreement and do a separate proprietary.
Yeah,
and
there you go.
have the rest of your software in the open source world, I think it's
Yeah.
great for that.
All right, so we'll talk about that. No, and those are both great comments and both very accurate and true comments. A lot of people do say that the license is harsh. A lot of people say they can't get through it. I don't dare try to replicate it here because it's pages upon pages upon pages. But I do want to, again, going back to the history major in me, give a little bit of historical context for what it is. So if you do dare try to pick it up and read it and make sense of it, you'll at least have some idea of why it is what it is. It is a manifesto written by a pissed off software engineer. Not, if you read it with that context, it's not written by a lawyer. And as a lawyer, it's exceptionally frustrating because his name was Richard Stallman. He's kind of notorious. He was working at MIT until just very recently. He got caught up in some other stuff just last week with the whole Epstein thing. But anyway, we put that aside. He was working at MIT, teacher at MIT. And he and some of his graduate students had a collaboration with AT&T, and this is like back in the late 70s, early 80s, to work on an old operating system called Unix, which was a very popular, powerful operating system of the day. AT&T was not really commercializing Unix at the time because there was no real personal computer market to commercialize it in. So they were happy to offer the source code to educational institutions for pedagogical, is that the word? Reasons, and say, here, you have it. And so guys like Richard Stallman would make improvements and then donate the improvements back to what he thought was the community, but really it was AT&T. And AT&T Bell Labs ultimately finds that there is a market for this thing and ultimately closed sources it, so to speak, and says, thank you for all those improvements, now we're gonna take this thing and everyone run with it. And Richard Stallman, being the kind of guy who would think of all software as an expression of human creativity and not something that should be taken from the world, cries foul. And I think rightfully so. You shouldn't leverage all of our hard work. So he comes up with this notion of copyleft, of the GPL. And at its heart, what the GPL says is, if we all collaborate on something, you can't take it and hide it. If we all work on something and create a derivative, we have to make it available for everybody to use at all times. And you can imagine where for a lot of commercial companies that are going to invest a lot of money and time in developing things, the idea of having to open source their stuff, having to make their source code available for use by anybody, including competitors, is not all that good. So underlying the GPL, underlying the whole movement are these 4 freedoms that he coined. And the beer theme comes up again. Free as in speech, not as in beer. Except today, we're going to enjoy free beer. That's why we came here. But I highlighted a couple in again, purple, because those are the ones you see why you have to have access to the source code, right? You couldn't study the program, and you couldn't improve upon it if you didn't have access to what it was that the source code says, what it does. The ones and zeros wouldn't tell you that. So with that background, I am going to hit like a couple of tops of the waves things about the GPL, because these are the most typical there's tons of misunderstandings, but these are a couple of biggies. One is when I talk to lawyers, they say, we have a zero tolerance for anything under the GPL. It can't come anywhere near our organization, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, you're using it. You're using it right now. You're using it, it's Linux is under the GPL. You're using it internally for data processing and other things. And to tell your organization that they can't use it because it's licensed under the GPL, you're basically saying, here's a great, great asset. Here's $50 on the floor, but don't pick it up. That's just not good. So I try to get lawyers to understand that there are plenty of uses, most specifically, an internal use of these tools has no issues whatsoever. So this isn't like kryptonite or something, right? You can use it. However, if you do make modifications and you do create a derivative work of code licensed to you under the GPL, and you do convey that, then you are supposed to let the world know that they can come and ask you for your improvements, the elements of that derivative that you created. And that's where, again, the issues arise. And this sort of stuff is an hour-long lecture. Happy to talk about it over the wonderful beer later. Yeah, and so this is the slide that calls out the fact that if you do create that derivative and you do then share that derivative outside your organization, you distribute that derivative, you do have to make your source code likewise available to work alongside the source code that you brought in under the GPL.
You got a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So does that mean that whatever I improve and whatever is directly tied to code that it is that it is using something that has a license of GPL needs to be made public? I don't have to make my whole system. If one of my components needs something that's licensed under GPL, that component has to be public.
So, in general sense, I'm going to say yes. There are other copyleft licenses that just act at the file level. There are some that act more holistically. The GPL will tries to reach as far as possible. So where that distinguishing line is, I can't really tell you. But again, you're getting to the nub of the thing, right? A lot of engineers want to come at this from an engineering perspective. If you read the FAQs, they talk about pipes and sockets and dynamic linking and static linking and all this sort of stuff. And I'm just that's not my thing, right? So I have to come at it from how I think a lawyer or a judge would interpret the GPL if it ever came to this, which, by the way, it hasn't. This thing's been out there since 1991. It's been challenged in all sorts of ways. It never has gone to a court to have a court read into it what it means. So that's part of what keeps us well employed, is that no one has any idea. So I come at it from a legal perspective of, is a derivative work created? And that's not all that helpful either, because there really is no good case law on what a derivative work is. So then that leaves me with something like this. Is it this tight? Is it this tight? Is it like this? Where is that? And it's hard to say, and that's why companies like Black Duck came to be, because so many people are very worried about investing time and energy in building up this element to go with this element and not knowing where that bright line is. I think a derivative work would say something along the lines of, does my stuff work without your stuff, then they're not derivatives. But alternatively, if my stuff won't do anything without relying on your stuff, then my stuff's probably a derivative of yours.
And then the other dividing line would be the trigger point back a few slides was distribution. So you took in the GPL type of code, you used it internally, worked, maybe refined it some, derivative portion, but other parts of your overall project, like you said, were always yours, always working here, and it was just simply needing a souped up, let's say, estimator, call for some glorified estimator, and that's what you used some GPL code and derived a little bit further refinement and then put the two together. And you're happy working that away, maybe even just offering that as on a server base, taking requests from outside for the results of that, and you're working a business model just fine. You've not yet distributed any parts of the code, the derivative work, the whole project. So that trigger point of distribution, again, the definition section of the different flavors of GPL have a nice way of trying to define at a conveyance level at what point is distribution. And that's the trigger point then that says, yes, you must give back to the community. And what you give back to the community, all different flavors, all different versions are going to say, is it just the derived work versus the whole project? And sometimes I come at it with the angle of, in addition to what Matt was saying, how closely coupled all these different components are, what you actually conveyed or distributed might have only been a separate sub-module. So did that part of the distribution trigger all the rest to be at play under the GPL license? And again, it depends on which version and the definitions embedded in there, how they're applied. And they've changed over time because they're trying to close certain loopholes, which I think Matt can describe.
Yeah, just real quickly, so that's a perfect segue. So under the GPL, because it was written first in 1991, I think, the idea of distribution, and actually under copyright law, the term distribution means the transfer of a physical copy, because they were still thinking on the lines of phonographs or whatever. So distribution under the GPL meant the transfer of something tangible. And obviously we've moved to a SaaS world where now software is about a service. It's not about giving you a disk anymore. Right. So that was one thing that the GPL, because distribution under the GPL, which triggered this obligation to make your source available, was on distribution of a physical copy. Well, what do you do with like a Google who never distributes anything but is running, God knows how many tens of thousands of Linux servers? Yeah. Well, you come up with something that calls in the net sort of networked aspects of this. So there's a new license called the Affero General Public License, which is the same thing but as a GPL, but it calls in software as a service now as a distribution. So
as long as that's running and based off of your project code, that loophole was trying to close that level of so-called distribution, non-distribution. Another question?
Just curious, because I know, like you're saying, it hasn't gone to court yet, and there's questions about this legality aspect of what's considered derivative work. If we're saying that you said like the idea is, okay, how tightly coupled is it? Can this work without this other thing to consider it? So wouldn't, like, for instance, if it's written for a particular for a particular operating system, it's going to call into the hooks of that operating system. Does that mean that that operating system is a derivative work of that operating system if it's Linux only? Yeah, it just seems like that wouldn't hold up, and I don't know.
No, you're right, and those are the kind of evaluations you have to make before you go doing that. Yeah.
But it would be different if it ran on another operating system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what if you had a Linux only call and there's now is it a derivative of Linux that it just, I don't know, because there's a lot of software out there that's Linux only. Is that all derivative of Linux?
Well, it's a license under. Go look at what some of the stuff is licensed under.
Yeah.
See if it's licensed under GPL v2 as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So another loophole that I think over time that the Freedom of Software Foundation was trying to close had to do with the interplay between patents and copyrights, the traditional sense of how restrictive that could be because the owner of either of those sets of rights is the controller. So to help all software be free and break down some of those barriers, there are clauses in some of the open source licensing that address the interplay between patent rights and protections and how much of those rights are being passed down along the stream along with the copyrights. And certainly the more restrictive licenses started off with perhaps an implied sense of that type of interplay between patents, but became much more expressive in the next slide. I can give you some of those points. But from a true patent law perspective, the OSS licenses is not a bar to patentability for you to, in conjunction with using your OSS types of projects and proliferating the source code in that direction, as well as making your own innovations, you still have the right to be filing patent applications to protect your engineering concept innovations. Copyright tends to be very single version focused, as Matt was saying. The Copyright Act was written back in the days when it truly meant individual copies of the covered work. So that single version is what the copyright law is trying to protect for a set of source code. And the next version, the next update, the next upgrade, those are all different literary works, different versions. Patents, on the other hand, is that engineering concept level of what you found was a nifty trick between problem A and the solution, and whether that trick is actually coded up in C++ using certain parts of whatever operating system and some 2 lines of code are GPL'd or whatever, that's one implementation, one version. Patents can actually cover all the different implementations of that engineering concept. So keep that in mind, that there really can be a balance between copyleft and the patent protection. And same with, I'll get to the specific kinds of conveyances of these patent rights that were tried to be spelled into GPL version 3 and higher, more recent times. Just that as that contributor is passing downstream their derivative work, the same terms of the OSS licensing that they inherited, also any patent rights that belong to that same owner are being included in the GPL version 3. So that's the trick, though. In the university setting, I often run into that the person who is writing the code becomes the copyright owner of the code, doesn't always hold the patent rights, because the university has policies on assigning back those invention rights to the university to be the owner of the patent rights. So you can't license out what you don't own. But nonetheless, that was in the Freedom Software Foundation's thought, was let's put together as much of all the different IP blends and passing that forward in the licenses to free up the software, the source code. Apache licenses have a much more limited license grant as far as It's trying to attach both the copyright and the patent rights to your contribution as a contributor into the downstream part of the OSS community, where GPL 3 and higher looks at not just your contribution, but the overall program. As I was saying, it could be lots of other components at play here, and once you put that out there, because you had GPL'd certain pieces of code, the GPL licenses are trying to grab not just your contribution, but the whole program, and include in that patent rights that could be associated with that innovation. Retaliation clause is worth mentioning. So even if you're not the one who institutes the patent litigation, which is against a lot of the GPL licensing, but let's say you're being sued and you feel you're filling out all the defenses that you can, and one of them is a counterclaim, that the actual patent infringement to your opponent. That retaliation is also considered anti-patent, part of the what the Freedom of Software Foundation was trying to accomplish here. They just don't really want to have much appreciation for the patent boundaries when dealing with open source software. So you can find some of the retaliation clauses. Examples are in the Apache version 2 as well as GPL version 3. So there are, though, many good examples where there's been this blend of start a new technology, blockchain. The underlying pieces of code actually were open source, all of these different versions for Bitcoin, for Hyperledger. But at the same time, how many patent applications were filed just in a single year that are aimed at blockchain? So there's living proof that we can blend and balance the OSS world, copyright, copyleft, along with the patent applications and patent field of trying to protect your IP. So one last question probably would come to mind for startups and entrepreneurial types of, if you already know in advance, though, that your invention is going to be distributed, and you're banking on leveraging all of that wonderful community source code, so why would you bother patenting if you already have kind of your first few steps are down this road? Several good reasons. You do want to secure that competitive edge. Back to that slide of the business model, the balance in your IP portfolio. Don't just bank on domain name trademarks. You really want that blend. And certainly patents in a licensing situation, licensing out, can generate a revenue stream for you. So, and that's part of how universities use their inventors and patent rights to use that as the feedback into the whole ecosystem. That revenue stream can be very helpful there. Patent rights are considered an asset, so you're building up your portfolio and putting yourself in a better position for acquisition, if that's your whole game plan as a startup. So I think there are all of those issues and questions that will come along your way, and you need to keep that in mind as far as what the balance will be. So I think I love this chart of Matt's. Puts it all together.
Yeah, I think it is a good visual, and it's one that sums it up graphically really well, what the challenges are. So so consider these folks up here, the engineers at an organization, right? They have access to the same source forges and every place else that the folks at my company have access to gather all that open source stuff. And when you tell these engineers, we need you to create some sort of widget, engineers, your organization, we need you to create something. They are not going to try to reinvent the wheel, right? Just like we as lawyers don't pull out a blank piece of paper and write whereas at the top. We find forms and we try to build off of work other people have done. We might charge you for the full doc, but we're trying to reuse good stuff. Well, these guys are going to do the same thing. We want them to do that, right? It goes back to that efficiency. So they'll go out and they'll find code that pre-exists, and the way software is built today, it's more of like puzzling together bits and pieces from a variety of places than a ground-up effort, and all good. But when they're selecting it, they're not looking at the licenses. They're not considering, if I take this piece of code and bring it into my code base, is it going to potentially impact my patent rights in some other domain or what have you? They're not doing that, right? So what the Black Duck tools did, by the way, is they basically sit here and become a mediator, right? They see, okay, you have selected this piece of open source. Before it goes to the code base, let me tag it. Let me understand what it is. Let me send an alert to legal, so legal can review the license, make sure that the license is compatible with the use case. Let me send an alert to the security people, make sure there's no known securities in that piece of code that's being selected. Let's also make sure that that piece of code is coming from a healthy open source project. Like, why select code from a dying open source project? And as Mary Lou was saying very early on, when it comes to acquiring other software, typically an organization has cut a PO for it. They've got legal involved. They've got other people involved. So there's this evaluation that just simply does not happen 9 times out of 10 with open source. And so this is like the big management issue we were talking about. What was it? What did I say before? 10 million man years worth of code. You've got a lot to worry about there. So I think I want to try to also bring this down to some of the practical things that we're seeing nowadays around open source. Again, lawyers getting very focused on, is this under the GPL? Am I okay with the license or not? But there's other things going on here. So there are enforcement actions that happen. As I said before, there's no legal action that has tried to interpret what the GPL says, but as you alluded to, there are legal actions that happen. I saw one file just this week, and typically what happens is a copyright holder releases a piece of code under 2 licenses simultaneously. They'll release it under the general public license for the sake of getting it out there, for the sake of building up goodwill, or maybe that version has some slight tweaks, like it requires you to publish at the bottom of, say, a page, a notice that says this came from X company. And then they'll also publish the same code under a commercial for-pay license for people who can't, for whatever reason, or don't want to, for obvious reasons, be bound by the GPL. So that's called dual licensing. And what happens is engineers fail to recognize that they've chosen the version that's licensed under the GPL, and they use it in a full-blown commercial context as if they had an OEM-style licensed piece of code. Those cases come up all the time. That happened, like I said, just this week. A company called Artifacts sued a company called Siemens, and Artifacts is making a lot of money doing this kind of thing. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that's a business model, and they're properly enforcing their rights under that model. The shifting licensing ideologies, actually, sorry. That last slide was kind of an overview of the things I want. Yeah, so there's a few of these kind of cases. The Cokinetic versus Panasonic, I should just talk about that one briefly. These are 2 companies that have been at each other's throats. And during discovery, Cokinetic learned that Panasonic had in their product some GPL code that they had never made anybody aware of and hadn't been following the GPL requirements. And so Cokinetic used that as a claim of, again, like unfair competition type stuff, and claimed themselves a third-party beneficiary of the GPL, saying to Panasonic, you've got to make all your code available. And the Zimpleware Versata one was really fun, really ugly. That one, Versata and Ameriprise had entered into a contract. Ameriprise was using some Versata code. The code was not quite great. Ameriprise said, okay, we'll fix it. In the process of fixing it, they were given access to the source. They found a GPL code licensed by Zimpleware, and then Versata and Ameriprise got into a fight. So Ameriprise said to Versata, okay, you want to keep this fight going? We're going to tell Zimpleware that in your code is some GPL stuff for theirs. And Versata said, sure, do it. So Ameriprise goes and does it. And Zimpleware says, thank you. Ameriprise goes after Versata, but then also goes after Ameriprise because Ameriprise had invested all sorts of time and money further developing around this thing. So these are how these things come to light anyway. It's usually, right?
Matt, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So all of these settlements are confidential.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's the feeling that they might be really large, or the feeling that they might be really small. Do you have any insight? I'm not asking you in each individual case, but when people settle these things, what's the consequence?
So I think it depends. And in Artifacts v. Hancom, as it says, it's a contract, so it's based on the value of the commercial license. So I think what happens is the court just looks at what Hancom did and how many versions of the copy of the software they should have licensed from Artifacts, and then extrapolate out a reasonable value, And I think this also gets back to why we've never had any court really try to decipher whether or not the copy left, make your source code available, obligations under the GPL, should, what the actual implications of that are, because typically under contracts issues you have two standard claims: an injunction, stop somebody from doing the bad thing that they're not allowed to do under the license, and secondly, pay a fee, damages, right? And so that's why I don't think we get. But anyway, I don't have an answer to your question, But I think it's those kind of calculations, so you could back into it if you wanted to.
Right. But do you? I'm going to keep pushing. So do you think is it in a 6-figure settlement, a 7-figure settlement, an 8-figure settlement?
I don't know.
You don't know. Just because you look at this from the outside and you say confidential settlement. I've been a part of settlements that were $2,700, and I've been part of settlements that were a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot more than that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so for folks in the audience saying, you can easily get in the $1 million plus.
Yeah,
$10
you could.
million plus.
You could.
Yeah.
I bet we could find. I don't know how we'd find out.
Yeah, or even just based off of given the dates and how long they were at it.
Yeah.
They've already spent how much in different
Right.
attorney fees and so forth.
Yeah.
So I think that as a fraction of what the highest end, if it went to jury, judge, and damage calculation and all that. So the settlement's probably some next fraction multiplier in the middle. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense.
Right.
I mean, just hypothesizing how attorneys would go about negotiating that.
Right.
So,
Okay.
I'm
know you don't
guessing
really
that some
know,
of them.
but I was trying to get
Right.
folks to get some understanding.
Yeah,
of the
I mean, I think it's
magnitude of
significant
this
enough
thing
that you don't want to mess it up, right?
Right.
And
Right.
and it is easy to not mess up,
Right.
But really, one of the overarching principles behind the slide is just to point out that back in the day, it was the Software Freedom Law Center or the Free Software Foundation or these other community-based organizations that were enforcing licenses. And nowadays, what we're seeing is commercial companies going after commercial companies with real money on the line. So that's just a whole different driver, a whole different set of incentives. So it does raise the stakes some. And then the shifting licensing ideologies, these are a couple of developments that are pretty recent, but basically companies that started out with big open source plans grew their organizations and grew their presence because they were very permissive and open and pursued an open source style business model that encouraged big collaboration and big involvement from lots of people. And then all of a sudden realized they were sitting on super, super valuable stuff that they couldn't monetize because they were under open source licenses that don't allow them to monetize it. And so here are two that, and I put the toothpaste, you can't squeeze it back into the tube. So if there's any budding entrepreneurs in here who are thinking about starting their own projects and are choosing open source licenses, I would suggest you stop and think about what license are you picking, because if you do succeed at what you're trying to do, you might find yourself handcuffed down the road if you try to then monetize your own thing, and you might find that other people can leverage it to a hilt. Yeah.
So you cannot go to GPL if you're open. So Redis,
Yeah.
which I've been looking at, which is cool,
Yeah.
by the way. I was thinking about using it, so I don't have to be afraid ever in the future, because they're not allowed to change.
Redis is, so Redis is under the Apache license up until recently, and then they went to this Redis source available license, which basically says you can't commercialize the version, but prior versions are still under the Apache, so you can use that. So you'd have to, you have to read the license, unfortunately, but Redis was, and MongoDB, same sort of thing. They were looking at this saying, wow, we built these incredibly powerful databases, and we can't leverage them ourselves, but everybody else is and making tons of money off
Yeah.
them.
That was, the
Yeah.
whole point of software being free. So,
And then OpenChain is a project of the Linux Foundation that's gaining a ton of traction. OpenChain is trying to establish a set of, and it will be an ISO standard, a set of standards for communicating information around open source that's in your product. So there'll be a standardized bill of materials, sort of ingredients list, where you as a low-level vendor will communicate up to the next person in the supply chain. Here's all the stuff, all the open source stuff in my product, and they'll take it and they'll look at your BOM, your bill of material, and it'll be positioned in a certain way that they can readily understand it. It matches the format that they expect. They then add their information onto that same set of same BOM sort of structure all the way up the line, so that when it gets to, say, Volkswagen, because this is big in automotive, that Volkswagen can know that that everybody down the line was following a certain specification, and they can trust that the BOM is good. And then I'm kind of going fast, we're running out of time. And then the other huge element of this, of course, is security. And the big distinction here, going back to like the Microsofts of the world versus typical open source projects, is in the Microsoft world, when you license from Microsoft, you're going to get patches, updates. You might not even know they're pushing this stuff to you. In the open source world, it's totally on your shoulders. You're the ones who took the open source. You're the only one who might know you have it. So you're the one responsible for keeping your eyes and ears open and figuring out if any of that open source has been found to have a security vulnerability. Yeah, and the vulnerabilities in open source are they're typically like flaws in the way the code was written. You know, they're not necessarily malicious. They're not like someone set out to try to create a problem necessarily, but you know, a lot of people contributing and things happen. And so sometimes so the point is, if you run typical virus or security software against most of the stuff, you're just not going to find those kind of flaws. Those tools are not meant to find those kind of flaws. The only way you know is that you have a bill of materials, you have a list of all the open source you're using, and you're comparing that list against, I don't have it here, but things like the National Vulnerability Database, which is a database maintained by the U.S. federal government, which, by the way, they don't maintain during shutdowns. So you have your list, and then you're kind of pinging your list against the National Vulnerability Database, and then there's plenty of these commercial databases you can subscribe to, and that's pretty much how people do it. Other than Equifax, who the whole Equifax fiasco was caused by an unpatched open source component called Apache Struts, and what happens a lot of times is these vulnerabilities get made known a long time ago. Like in this case, they're made known a long time ago, and so a researcher was doing some research, found this flaw. They'll typically kick the tires on the flaw, see if they can exploit the flaw. Flaw. Think of it like leaving your front door unlocked, right? You might not really care. Depending on what your risk tolerance is or what's behind your door, but other people might care. So what the researchers then do is they publish it to the world. They let the whole world know. And in that moment, the good guys know and the bad guys know. So from August 21, 2012 forward, that vulnerability was sitting out there. Now, I say introduced here, by the way, because they know when that particular set of code was contributed to Apache Struts. It would happen here. That's when it was brought into the Apache Struts project. I'm not sure by who. The vulnerability was discovered March 7, 2017, meaning that's when the researchers found it, published to the world what the vulnerability was, and also published a YouTube video on how to exploit the vulnerability. And so that happened on the same day. So in that moment, the clock really starts ticking for Equifax, right? If they had a tool like the tools that Black Duck licenses, what would have happened is the Black Duck tool would have recognized Apache Struts in their bill of material, would have sent them an immediate text alert or something to Jira or something else that said, hey, by the way, you've got this code that's been found and be subject to this exploit, and here's a temporary, here's an immediate patch for it, but they didn't have that. They do now, by the way. And then it was added to the National Vulnerability Database. A week later, the National Vulnerability Database tends to be a little slow in updating these things. The commercial tools like ours are immediate. And then, but still, even if you were to give Equifax the benefit of the doubt and say, all right, they're going to rely on the NVD, the hackers attack here, and Equifax didn't even know they had that component until much later. So, I think it's just negligence personally. But anyway, that's.
Further questions? I'm glad. It sounded like you were already kind of dabbled in this and then possibly ran into a gray area that you wanted to learn more and ask questions. So appreciate everybody who's attended. But happy to answer any further questions. All good?
Yeah.
Or over?
I've got a question. So open source licenses can be incredibly confusing if you're not used to reading the foreign language of legalese. Where does a person start? Before the toothpaste comes out of the tube and you have an idea and you want to create the software and you'd like to release it open source, where does a person start in terms of determining what's an appropriate license?
Well, your starting materials, hopefully any code that you put into the candidate list of what you're going to be writing and eventually putting into an end product to distribute. Start seeing if those already have an attached license with certain terms. And if you have options to fetter out the more restrictive termed set of code and you have other candidate code that's freer, that's a good, I'll say, top level kind of outline of what are your choices, and thoughtfully try to put together those choices so that you understand well before you get to your end product if you've handcuffed yourself or if you still have some open boundaries. And the easiest answer would be not to even go into any open sourced code, but if time is money and time to market is money, that's a very impractical, theoretical solution to the question. But certainly go with your eyes open out of what your candidate choices are before you've set it in stone that that's the direction you're going to develop with. You think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, what you license in has to match what you license out, or else you can't do what you're intending to do. So that's definitely the first concern. And then I would also just look at what your commercial goals are and make sure that you choose a license that's compatible with that. Yeah.
So when you sort of, again, if you're creating software and you use sort of multiple different sort of open source products that use a similar, again, one of the, say, the MIT license that says, you need to include this copyright information or this. Do you include multiple copies of that in your license agreement? Do you sort of say, portions of this are created, or used on the MIT license agreement or something like that?
Yeah.
How exactly do you do that when you sort of include?
So there are various answers you'll get to that question. And because a lot of people see this whole thing as an administrative nightmare and they don't want to have to be burdened with it. So a lot of people do try to find shortcuts and ways around it. I often just say to people, if you got a piece of code under a license and that license includes an attribution notice, which I think they all do, I just replicate the entire license. Even if you're going to then see 50 MIT flavors of licenses in your notices file, it's just not worth your time to try to figure out if there are any slight variations between any, or make sure you're copying over correctly the names of the developers for whom attribution is necessary. So it becomes a mess, is what it. But
when you go to, again, when you're on a site, say it's something like GitHub or whatever, it basically just says, which license, and it just says uses the Apache license. I mean, it doesn't say this is our license terms. It just says uses.
I'm not saying to say this is your license terms. I'm just saying that what that person did was try to meet their attribution requirement by saying this is under the Apache license. If that's all it said, they haven't met that requirement, because they're supposed to give notice for the individual author of the code that they took under the Apache license. So all I'm saying is that many people will just decide, I'll just take the code as it came to me under license that it was given to me, and I'll replicate that entire license and just be done with it. It's slightly burdensome and potentially, possibly slightly conservative, but it ultimately.
What I'm saying is that sometimes it doesn't seem like they actually say, this is the license. They basically just say, oh, well, we use this other license over here. They don't have, sort of, you need to put this, this is who we are, and this is, this is the language that has to go in your agreement. It basically just on the website where you download the source, it basically just says, this is available under such and such license.
Yeah, and you should be able to contact them from that to say that you need to see the full set of clauses that they are referring to. Oftentimes I've run into where, just like you said, they use the title, Apache 2, MIT blah, but when you actually obtained a full copy of the license they were referring to, it was hybridized, and there's different clauses in there that truly are not an Apache clause. They've mixed and matched, and that's, to Matt's point, it's best to just go to the source contributor, ask for the copy that they were relying on, and then you use a full copy of that.
So we have time for one more question.
Okay.
If they're not providing you that full license, how how is this enforceable?
Right. So that's why I was saying you should have the opportunity from their website to contact them to say you referenced Apache by title only, and that you need a full copy of that. And most of the times I'm finding that they'll say something like, oh, well, it's stored on GitHub, we'll give you the access link for it, or there's a couple other steps to actually reach a link that will spell it all out for you instead of just the title that they're giving you.
My thoughts were, if you download the source, it should have that.
It should.
If it doesn't, I don't know how that could be enforceable.
Exactly.
Right.
But flip that around, it also means that you as a user have no idea what your rights are.
Right.
So
you
if you come across a piece of code that has no license assigned to it, you have to assume that the copyright holders retain for themselves all the rights under that piece of code, and that they're not giving you any rights to use it. You know what I mean? Maybe you're going to imply some rights or something based on.
Doesn't it have to say that?
No.
The traditional copyright set of rights will kick in, and
Yeah.
So there is a default.
The default is
You retain everything.
yeah, the
You
copyright
don't say
holder.
anything,
Right.
You're keeping all your rights.
Right.
Even though you released it.
Yes.
Right. So one of the things that drives lawyers nuts.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but one of the things that drives lawyers nuts is how much code is out there that's under no license. And you basically have to tell your client you can't use that. You have to go track down the copyright holder and find it. And a close second is things like Overstack or those places where you just see snippets of code. And what would that be under? It's under the terms of use of OpenStack or whatever. It can't be, because how do you know OpenStack had the right to, or the person who published OpenStack had the right to include those snippets? Where did that come from? So there's a lot of muddy.
This is much worse than I thought.
So literally, anytime you copy and paste from Stack Overflow, you now have this issue of you're including some rights that you are nebulous that you don't understand.
Exactly.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's like I think everything on all code that exists. I think.
So I think this feeling of dread and doom is a perfect opportunity, yes, for us to enjoy some warm networking and further go down this rabbit hole with Mary Lou and Matt. Please join me in thanking Mary Lou and Matt for joining us this evening. Thank you very much.